Today with Jeremy van Wyk in for Kino Cummies
on CapeTalk.
All the way through until 12 o'clock, we're having loads of fun in studio. We want you to be a part of it. So give us a call, 021-446-0567. As usual, we are joined by the naked scientist, Dr. Chris Smith. And he answers all your science questions, even the wacky ones. Now, I've never heard someone know, I've never known someone who knows so much about everything. And that is not a lie. Chris, good morning. Thank you so much for joining me. How
you're
are
obviously
you?
less popular than I thought you were then, Jeremy. Yeah, I'm good. I'm all right. How are you?
I'm well. We have beautiful weather in the mother city, so I have no complaints.
Okay, don't rub this in, because obviously we're sliding into winter now.
I know.
And
I know.
We're all very worried about that because, of course, with winter comes the usual seasonal suspects, the lineup of nasties and lurgies that come and assail us, flu, and now we've got coronaviruses on top of that. So everyone's hunkering down, waiting for the long winter. And, of course, the one thing we can't do this year so easily is to go and seek out some sun. Because my solution, my clever solution was always to get all these gigs in the southern hemisphere over winter time and then fly to Australia or go to South Africa.
Right.
go and make some vitamin D. No chance of that this year.
Chris, actually talking about vitamin D, so I've noticed that the doctors are upping the dosage of vitamin D, especially for elderly patients in the state hospital, in the public health system. So what my uncle gets, he's in the public health system. And he's in his 70s. And what I've noticed the doctors do for the past 2 months is they prescribe a very high dose, I think it's calciferol or something, of vitamin D. And apparently this has the ability, or it helps stop you being infected from the coronavirus, but also helps with other ailments. Is that true?
Well, people are certainly looking at this. And if you look at the list of drugs that Donald Trump was given when he was admitted with coronavirus in recent weeks, on that list is vitamin D. Interestingly, not on that list is hydroxychloroquine, the drug that he'd previously thought was extremely valuable.
Yes,
but actually proper clinical data have now been brought to bear to prove what does work and what doesn't work. And people are still exploring this. Vitamin D is certainly a very useful mediator and signal in the body for a range of different things. It does control blood calcium levels, and one must be very careful with vitamin D supplements because we do see elderly people who have been put on vitamin D supplements and artificial forms of vitamin D because they're at risk of things like osteoporosis. And because they're taking this for a long period of time, they end up with levels of vitamin D that become toxic. They actually cause their calcium levels to climb alarmingly. And too high calcium is nearly as bad as too low calcium. So you have to be a bit careful because you can end up furring up bits of your body with calcium that shouldn't be there. So vitamin D can be useful. We know that many people in many countries are vitamin D deficient, especially in countries that have long drawn out winter times like the UK. I tested my vitamin D level a few years ago. I was really low. I was very surprised. I eat a very good diet. I'm very healthy, very, very sort of health conscious, but it had been wintertime. And at the end of a long winter, when you don't see much sun, you don't have the chance to make vitamin D from the sunlight, which it does in the skin. So you have to rely on dietary supplementation. And as a result, people do end up quite low in vitamin D in some places. It has been linked to immune function and other autoimmune conditions. So people are beginning to think that perhaps it might have a role to play, or at least low levels of vitamin D may have a role to play in the severity of coronavirus. It's under active investigation. There is no clear data yet as to which way it lies. But people are looking into this because it may be another one of those things that we could do that will make a difference.
Amazing. Thank you so much. That's Dr. Chris Smith. He's the naked scientist. He's with me until 10 o'clock this morning. Get those questions in for Chris on 072-567-1567 or give us a call on 021-446-0567. Chris, a WhatsApp coming in here from a previous question for, I think it's last week, on conscience, about the function of the conscious being located in the front lobe of the brain. So the question really is, do narcissists have an underdeveloped, understimulated frontal lobe as children because most of the behavior is construct or lint? However, when dealing with a narcissist in real life, as for example, a life partner, are there certain nutrients, foods, activities that can stimulate, reactivate an underdeveloped frontal lobe to decrease narcissism and enable them to grow a conscience?
I don't know the answer to this question, and I don't think we actually know the answer to this question because I don't think anyone has done a comprehensive study. And if anyone knows the data, do let me know. I don't think anyone's done a comprehensive study where they've found people with different personality types or personality disorders and then subjected them to volumetric brain studies where you put them in a scanner, work out which bits of the brain are overdeveloped and underdeveloped, and then checked that that size isn't being or is being reflected in how connected the brain areas are. Because what we've learned in recent years is it's not just all about size. Size is important in terms of different bits of the brain because areas of the brain that are bigger have more nerve cells in them and they can do more processing. But that's no good if they're not connected in the right way to other brain areas. So people are now beginning to do studies where they look at how information flows through the brain from one area to the next. This is the connectivity map of the brain, and that makes a very big difference as well. So if you've got an area that's underdeveloped or appears to be smaller than it should be, but it's very richly connected, it may well be that compensation has occurred to keep information flowing the right way. So at the moment, it's very much we don't know how different personalities map onto different brain structures. I don't think anyone does, and I don't think the data exist. In terms of whether or not you can make a difference here, there appears to be a critical window in your brain when you're growing up. And when you're a little baby, your brain is very plastic and moldable. It can change, it can be adapted, and it does that in response to stimuli. So if you grow up in an environment that is very rich, and as in in terms of its stimulus, and in terms of education, in terms of love, and sort of emotional nutrition, then your brain will develop very differently than an individual who grows up in a very deprived of love, deprived of stimulation, deprived of education, that sort of growing up. And when you get to a certain age, despite reintroducing some of those things that might have been missing early on, you can't get back what you could have had it been introduced from the get-go. There's a critical window period in the development of the brain, and so as a result, that's why education in young children is so important, because the brain you have when you're a kiddie is not the brain you have when you're an adult. You don't have that ability again in your life, so we waste that opportunity at our peril. That said, we can always do something, and people who have certain disorders or people who want to improve in certain things, practice does make perfect. And so helping people to develop strategies that might not put them right, but help them to overcome certain personality problems, traits, things that make their life difficult, emotional issues, they can be helped. And you can learn strategies because the brain is big, it's intelligent, we're an intelligent species. So we can use some of our brain power to develop alternative strategies to help us think along the right lines when we do have other problems. Basically, it's a question of if you haven't got the right tool for the job, you can fashion another one to do the job
right.
and help. So I don't know the direct answer to this question. I don't know if anyone does, but I do know that certainly people can learn what traits in their behaviour cause problems, and they can learn to recognise when they might step over the mark, and they can learn how to compensate, and they won't ever perfectly behave, get things right all the time, but they nevertheless can get things wrong less of the time.
Amazing. We have a couple of voice notes, questions for you, Chris. Let's hear what it is, Joe.
Good morning, Jeremy. I have a question for the naked scientist. We've recently seen sniffer dogs being used to track down COVID on the clothes of patients and so on. These are always big dogs. I'm just wondering whether little dogs, like little Maltese and so on, can be trained for sniffing out drugs and COVID and medical conditions. It always seems to be the larger dogs. Thank you. It's Sandra here.
What a wonderful question.
Sandra.
To my knowledge, small dogs do not have a sense of smell that's any less good than bigger dogs. A dog's brain, about a third of it, is devoted to smell, and that's why dogs are so good. And dogs live in an olfactory world. We live in a visual-dominated world because about a third of our brain size is devoted just to what we see and decoding it. Dogs, it's the other way around. So they're very much dominated by their sense of smell. And relatively speaking, small dogs also have a very overdeveloped olfactory system, and they do have an exquisitely sensitive sense of smell. I think it comes down to trainability, practicability, and the kinds of breeds that we know lend themselves very well to being trained, being handled and being working dogs, because not all dogs are great working dogs. Small dogs might get tired if they have to walk extremely long distances and sniff lots of people with COVID or lots of suitcases at the airport. Bigger dogs actually engage with that better. They're more receptive to the kind of play training that the handlers use in order to get them doing this sort of thing. So I think it really is a horses for courses type thing, to mix up metaphors. I think that the dogs that we have experience of, dogs that we have knowledge of how to train them well, and how to get them performing, and dogs that like doing that tend to be the breeds that they tend to use. Also more practical, because a big dog is going to find it easier to cover the distance than a smaller dog. Not sure if this is entirely true with a pug though, because pugs have breathing problems for reasons that we've inflicted upon them. But lovely question, and as far as I know, breed isn't so important, but it's really down to the practical nature of how you use your dog. Even rats, you could use a rat and a mongoose, for example. People are using rats to sniff out landmines because they can smell the explosives as they degrade under the ground from the landmine. The explosive odours ooze to the surface and the animals can smell them. Rats also have an exquisitely strong sense of smell, so you can use a small light animal like a rat to go sniffing out things and change its behaviour where it smells a landmine, and you can use that to detect the landmine. You wouldn't want to use a big dog because it would set the mine off, but a small rat doesn't weigh enough to do that. So lots of animals have an excellent sense of smell, and I think it's really down to what's practical for the job.
Okay. Your questions for Dr. Chris, the Naked Scientist, 021 446 0567, or the WhatsApp line 072 567 1567. Send us your questions via voice note, and Chris will answer your questions. Rod in Muizenberg. Good morning, Rod.
Good morning, Jeremy. My question is about hearing, and good morning, Chris.
Morning, Rod.
As you know, as one gets older, your hearing deteriorates, and particularly in a situation where there are a number of people around and background noise. Now, is that because one loses hearing for the higher frequencies? What actually causes that?
Rod, this is called the cocktail party problem, which is that the human ear and the brain is exquisitely good at dissecting out one person's conversation from all of the background hubbub. So if you go into a noisy environment, it is a feat of incredible evolution that you can concentrate, despite this maelstrom of sound energy assailing your ears, what the person in front of you or to the side of you or just up there on the stairs is saying, and pull out that information from the background hubbub. And this is because the auditory system is very fine resolution, and it can focus in and tune the organ of hearing, the cochlea, to specific frequencies, but also it tunes into specific patterns. And people have done experiments where when I'm talking to you, your brain is modelling what I'm saying, and it's anticipating what's going to come next and where to listen for. And because it knows what I'm expected to say next, it hears those sounds coming in and confirms what it thinks I'm going to say next, and therefore it makes sense. And this is why, if you're in an environment where someone's talking to you in a language with a strong accent, or if your hearing isn't quite as good as it used to be, it's much harder to predict what's going to come next and then get that information coming in and confirm it. The studies that have been done on this, there was a very nice series of studies where people were played a sequence of sounds. Imagine just a blip, 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 blip. And what they did was to insert the odd extra tiny blip into the sequence and asked people if they could tell where a sound wasn't quite right. And because the brain quite quickly tuned into where you should be hearing blip noises in that pattern, you could tell where the extra blips were coming from. So it comes down to the fact that if your hearing deteriorates, you're already struggling to decode the sounds that are coming in. And then when you're in a noisy environment, it becomes even harder to do this trick. And that's why people then suffer with hearing loss and this cocktail party maelstrom of information that they can't decode so easily as we get older. So it's a mixture of a good acuity of hearing and then the brain predicting what it wants to hear next based on decoding the information and then anticipating it, listening for it, picking it up, and then that makes sense. But if you're in a really noisy environment, it's already cognitively demanding. And then on top of that, with a bit of hearing loss, it just overwhelms the system, and your brain can't work fast enough in order to make it possible.
Thank you so much for that question, Rod. We have more questions coming in on 072-567-1567. Chris, I don't know if this is science or superstition, but I'm sure you'll set us right here. The question is, whenever I don't know what to make of this, Chris. My left hand always itches before I receive money. Is this superstition or science? Is there any validity? Does this make sense?
Well, it does, in the sense that we know that the nervous system isn't like the wiring in a person's house, where one light switch is wired uniquely and specifically to one light bulb. The way the brain is worked out is that pretty much everything is connected to everything else, by and large. But some things are much more richly connected to some targets than others. So, if I am going to reach out and take a jar off the shelf, my brain doesn't just turn on the muscles which are in my arm, in my forearm, in my hand and in my fingers to do the reaching and then the pinching maneuver to pick up the jar. My brain is sending a barrage of messages to mainly the muscles in my arm, forearm, wrist, fingers, but it's also facilitating activity in a lot of other groups of nerve cells which are going to also help and support that movement. So, for instance, it's going to make my back straighter. It's going to shift my weight over my legs to make me stand up straighter, to help me stand on tiptoe and support me while I reach out into an abnormal way, load my body in a strange way and grab that jar. And in the same way that because we've got a brain that's wired up like that, where there are connections that go richly to one area, but there's some less targeted connectivity, in the same way, when certain emotions happen or you anticipate certain things happening, you will also switch on other parts of your body. And you can think of this as almost like a synesthesia for money. And synesthesia is when you present certain words or numbers or ask people to think along certain lines, they will experience a different sensation in a different modality in their brain. People classically with synesthesia will have colours for certain words. Maybe a day of the week, Monday will be green. And when I say that, people think, I just don't understand what he's talking about. People who have this will know exactly what I mean, because when they see the word Monday or they hear the word Monday, if they've got this sort of condition, and it can be anything that triggers this, they will also experience a flash of colour in their mind's eye. And I suspect that this is a similar sort of thing when a person's thinking and has emotions about, I'm going to get paid, I'm going to get some money, that this also causes that particular bit of miswiring in the brain, or whatever that richer wiring in the brain that corresponds to that sensation, to be recruited, and it's presented to your consciousness. And I think that's probably what's happening in this person. I know somebody who actually worked or used to work for Prime Media and in Joburg, and she told me that actually when she was worried about something, she would get a funny feeling in her area. So it isn't just your left hand. It can be any part of your body. So particular worry or whatever, or excitement can produce funny sensations in all kinds of places.
Amazing. Chris, another WhatsApp coming in here.
Hi, Jeremy. What the good doctor left out was the machoism of walking around with a German Shepherd sniffing out drugs versus the same cop with a toy pom. It just doesn't bode well. Using a toy pom.
Yeah, it's an image thing.
To go through dangerous drug lords' houses. Cheers.
He's quite right, isn't he? Yeah, there's a very important image question. Although it would be rather funny, wouldn't it, to see a cop with a tiny little kind of toy poodle or something this is my police dog. It would be very funny. But the point I made stands. Physiologically, there are no reasons, I think, in the olfactory system, but I think it's a practical one in terms of the size, the anatomy, and the trainability of the animal and its tolerability for the kind of work you're asking it to do. Very good point. Thank you for that.
My guest is Dr. Chris Smith. He's the Naked Scientist, and of course we answer all your science-related questions, even the wacky ones, and we make sense of all of that for you on a Friday morning. Here's another question for you, Chris.
Hi, Professor Smith, or Dr. Chris Smith, David here. I'd like to know whether, the coronavirus has any sort of impact upon the incidence of, or the increased incidence or susceptibility of type 1 diabetes in children? David, thank you.
Hello, David. The answer is that type 1 diabetes, which is the condition where you lose from your pancreas the beta islet cells, these cells make the hormone insulin, and if you lose those cells, you can't make any insulin, and insulin controls blood sugar, so you end up with very high levels of sugar in the blood, and the cells in the body can't pick up that sugar, so you end up with a person starving, effectively, with very high blood sugars. And there are all kinds of consequences of that. And type 1 diabetes is an immune condition, and it's where the immune system destroys the insulin-secreting cells in the pancreas. This leads you to the question, well, what causes the immune system to do that? And we know that in a proportion of people at least, antecedent, in other words, prior infections, certainly in some cases with viruses, can lead to this happening. And it may well be that the virus that comes in, and we think there are some particular kinds of enterovirus that do this, they will prime the immune system in a susceptible person to regard your own tissue as hostile and destroy it. So we know that in some people with type 1 diabetes, this is an autoimmune condition caused by a prior infection. At the moment, there is not evidence that the new coronavirus is causing type 1 diabetes. That doesn't appear to be the case. It's early days, people are watching this, but it may be the case that type 2 diabetes is linked to the new coronavirus. And I don't mean as in people who've already got type 2 diabetes tend to have a much worse outcome with coronavirus infection. They do. They're more likely to get COVID, which is the severe disease associated with coronavirus infection. But there's evidence now that people, when they catch coronavirus, it doesn't just attack the lungs. In a proportion of people, and we don't yet know what proportion, but this becomes a multi-system inflammatory condition. And probably the virus winds up the immune system, and the immune system then goes on to attack other tissues. And it seems to cause a sustained inflammatory state, one feature of which is impaired handling of glucose. And so you see some people who become diabetic or develop diabetic type blood markers in the aftermath of coronavirus infection. We don't know what will happen in the long term to those people, and it's early days, but there may well be that that is occurring, but it's not because the virus has attacked the pancreas per se. It may well be that it's an inflammatory thing provoked by the immune response, and this is a metabolic syndrome that's kicked in the aftermath of coronavirus, a bit different from type 1 diabetes.
Dr. Chris, we are running out of time. Sadly, we have one last caller for you, Jen in Komiki. You have 30 seconds with the Naked Scientist.
Hi, good morning, Doctor.
Hi, Jen.
Just one quick question. A couple of weeks ago, somebody was asking you about why you itch, your skin itches, and I phoned in too late to find out why, when you pick up something heavy and you can't reach your nose, why suddenly do you need to rub your nose and have an itch that you can't reach?
I think, Jen, this is a classic example of attaching significance to coincidence, which is that the 9,999 times that you picked up the jug and didn't need to itch your nose, you didn't notice and didn't remember. Whereas the one time it happened and it drove you nuts and it made you drop the jug and there was a mess everywhere, and then you got that relief from scratching your nose, you then remember that one, so you think of it as, every time I pick up a jug, my blinking nose itches and I need to scratch it. And so it is a sort of confirmation bias. You attach significance to something that happened coincidentally and then regard that as the norm when in fact it was the exception.
We're going to have to leave it there. Chris Smith, the Naked Scientist. Doc, thank you so much for joining us. You'll be back with us next week,
I will.
Friday. Have a lovely weekend.
Been a pleasure. Thanks, everyone. Have a great weekend, and cheers, Jeremy. See you soon.
Okay, bye-bye.